Professor Curtis, ever our sensei, has instructed me to instruct you to go back to your seats. And I always do what Jerry tells me to do, most of the time. So I am delighted. We were having a fantastic conversation on Japan, and as Francis says, as I look out at the room, there's so much expertise in the audience that I think most of us up here at the panel are somewhat daunted by the task assigned to us. But my name is Sheila Smith. I'm the Senior Fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks to my dear friend and colleague, Victor Cha, I am also honored at times to teach at Georgetown's Asian Studies Department. So I am gratified to be both in the scholarly world and also in the world of policy down in Washington. We have a terrific group of people here on the panel. As Francis said, all Jerry's students who have come, two of whom, I should say, have come from Japan to be here to celebrate this great day with Jerry and to talk about a subject that often invites great dissonance and difference inside Japan as well as out. To my immediate right is Takehiko Tani, who is an associate professor at the National Defense Academy of Japan. I should say that Takako is here in her private capacity. She is not here to represent the views of her institution or her government. So she will say whatever she wants to say, but she will not be held accountable by anybody back in Tokyo. Next to Takako is Andrew Oros, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Washington College. He is an author of many articles and path-breaking books on Japanese security policy. And then to his left is Akitoshi Miyashita, who is the Professor of International Politics at Tokyo International University. And I was a colleague of Akis when I was here at Columbia, and I haven't seen him in many years. And it's one of the great joys of today is not only we get to help Jerry celebrate, but we also get to see each other again. I want to just take a moment to pause because not only is Curtis Sensei here, but Curtis's Sensei's Sensei is also arrived. And I want to recognize and welcome James Morley. Thank you, Jim, for coming all the way here to be with us on this great day. I wanted to follow the precedent that Frances and her panelists set by sharing a little story or two and thanking Jerry. There'll be more stories later, so this is the good one. This is the better one. But I wanted to say that anybody who's been at Columbia or anybody who's had PhD students know that every now and then they disappear into the field and they have to be brought back home. And I had been at Columbia as an undergraduate working with Jim Morley. I stayed in Japan to do research on my dissertation so long that Jim retired. And I remember sitting in Tokyo and having Jerry walk up to me going, all right, it's time to come home. Enough is enough. And for that, Jerry, I thank you, because I would have stayed happily, ensconced in interviews and doing everything else that I was doing in Tokyo. Years later, as I said, I'm now teaching at Georgetown this semester, teaching a course on Japanese domestic politics. And as I attempted to put the course together, I went back to all the books that Jerry had written, and the books that from election campaigning to the logic of Japanese politics. And I can say without a doubt that my students found those books the most informative and the most interesting to read. And again, I thank you for the contribution over the years. Takako, would you like to share your story?
Hi, I'm Takehiko Tani. I'm the most recent PhD student of Jerry's, and it's really difficult not to choke up thinking about this because I started a long time ago, and I even changed my topic to civil military relations. Then Jerry told me not to have a child until I finished, but now, my son is 18, so so you know how long it took. But he never gave up on me, and I was always able to come back to Columbia. And so I'm just very, very grateful that I can be here. And I think I might have been holding off Jerry's retirement. And if people are upset that he's retiring, it's my fault that I finished. I'm sorry about that. But I think that I'm very honored to be his last student and very, very honored to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew?
Thanks. I think I'd like to echo Frances's comment at the start of the first panel to thank Jerry for pushing us and me in particular to think deeply about the politics behind the policies that we were looking at. I chose to focus on Japan's security policies at a time that, soon after the Cold War ended, and I think that in my training in international relations theory, somehow I missed some of the politics of that, and being in a PhD program in political science really made me think about the politics. I'd also echo Francis's comment that I'm not so sure that Jerry was enthusiastically supportive of supervising a constructivist, informed study of security policy, but truly, I think his push to think about the politics and how that links to constructivist theory about norm change and influence on policy just was deeply impactful on my work in my first book, that my dissertation that was based on my dissertation, and also in my next book that I hope to be out next year, again, as I was working through the last stages and thinking about what really affected my thinking about Japan, it was once again really pushing the politics. I'd also just like to say, though, that it's just so meaningful to me to be back here at Columbia in general, and I think that I just feel so lucky that so many of my mentors that were just so influential in my thinking are still teaching here at Columbia, and when I come home it really feels like coming home because so many of you are here, including in this audience right now. So thank you, everyone. I remember in my first year at Columbia, I almost sort of crashed and burned, I think, in my first semester because I spent way too much time coming to symposiums like this and all of the incredible speakers that would come through Columbia. And now when I think back at my time living in New York City, it just is just one of the most exciting times of my life. So thank you to all of Columbia, but to Jerry, to you in particular.
Thank you. Aki, welcome back.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. First of all, I would like to thank Columbia University and East Asian Institute for inviting me to this special event. I would like to share one memory with Jerry Curtis, and that is the day for my dissertation defense. Up until that time, I thought my relationship with Curtis was quite good. I served his teaching assistant, and he gave me a lot of invaluable advice. When I was stuck with my topic, he said, look, this is the scholarship from the East Asian Institute. Use this money, go to Japan, do the research. When I came back, finishing up my dissertation, he said, now you spend too much time, so it's time for you to come to the dissertation defense. So, on the day that my dissertation, I spent about 10 minutes describing my topic, but Jerry was sitting doing like this and look at the, over there and shaking his hand. So what's happened to him? But that memory or nightmare still appears in my dream today. So that has a long-lasting impact on my life. Thank you, Jerry.
You know what is so wonderful about having everybody back is you get to say these things out loud. And you thought it was only you. But Jerry was such a mentor and such a strict mentor that we were all terrified. But we have survived and we're here, so thank you. So our panel is to talk about the Japanese military, in large part because in the theme of Is Japan Back, there has been a lot of policy reform, defense policy reform, largely under Mr. Abe, but it began, in fact, before he reassumed the prime ministership at the end of 2012. So the question today, and this panel is going to tackle a little bit, is, what is this new Japan? Is this a return to Japan that we would call normal? Is it Japan now much more comfortable with the exercise of military power? Is it instead a question about identity? In fact, that there's a younger generation in Japan today that actually wants to think of its nation as being a normal nation, a powerful nation, and in fact wants to have the military component of that kind of an identity, foreign policy identity. So we're going to start out, Takako, with you. Much has been made of the recent reforms. Some people ascribe them to your prime minister. But do you think Japan's approach to its military, has it really changed, or is this more a story of continuity?
Thank you, Sheila. I'd like to reiterate that this is my personal opinion, not the opinion of the Ministry of Defense or the Self-Defense Forces. But to your question, I think the answer is yes, but that the recent discussion in the Diet about over the security legislation also shows some issue that hasn't changed, and I'd like to highlight both of that. How it was, and before we start talking about how it has changed, I think we need to look at how it was before. And in terms of how it was before, and if I were to try to focus on not the substance of the policy change, but as you mentioned, the approach to the military, I think the characteristic of Japan's approach, or the Japanese government approach, and also Japanese public's approach to the military is that they were more concerned about protection from the military than the protection provided by the military. And as a result of that, there was a lot more attention to how to contain military power, and very strong emphasis on restrictive measures. And I argued in my recently defended dissertation that there was a paradox from that, is that the very strict constraint on the politicians about how they could use the military actually might have hampered their ability to control the self-defense forces because they were so constrained. They didn't have to think about what happens when they're not constrained as much. And also the fact that there was such a strong external constraint or institutional constraint, it actually made some relatively autonomous or a space for the self-defense force to be relatively autonomous from the political sphere because of the constraints. I argue that those two to be the paradox. But I do see that this is much less the case. And I think that it's not something that happened during this current Abe administration, but more of a reflection of a change that has been happening over past 25 years. And I think the motivation for the change is not really just about the rise of China per se. I think a lot of the changes that took place had a lot to do with how the relationship between the politicians and the bureaucrats have changed over the 25 years, which is the more emphasis on how politicians make decisions, not the bureaucracy. So I think it's not just driven by external threat or perception of threat, but rather something that's been changing within the Japanese domestic political institutions. And as for the signs of change, I think it's clear that the self-defense force is no longer seen as something that has to be contained. I think there's a lot of emphasis on engagement. And the most notable example is that the current, according to the Cabinet Administrative Office poll, currently the Japanese public, 92.2% of the Japanese public have a positive view of the self-defense force. And this is not to say that it happened all after the earthquake relief effort. It was always about in the 70s. It was not that low. Maybe there tends to be a perception that it was very low. It was never that low. It was always in the 70s. But it is quite striking that it's 92.2%. And that this happened despite the relative lack of engagement with the self-defense forces, because I think it was, although you might not see anybody in person, it is more likely that they saw the relief efforts of 3/11, and also abroad, there's a lot more cooperation with the aid agencies and such, which were not initially politically that welcoming of the military, and that since there's crisis management is becoming a much more of a hot issue for the local governments, there's lots of self-defense force officers who are now in charge of those issues. And I mentioned that despite the lack of engagement, I think the current understanding of the Japanese public to the self-defense forces is not that much of a mystery, but still there hasn't been an assessment of what they think. So I conducted a survey, a civil military gap survey of opinion and attitudes of self-defense forces officers, and what I found was there actually isn't that much of a gap between the civil and the military. So in a way, although they were somewhat contained or not very much engaged with the rest of the Japanese public, or especially the political elite in Tokyo, in fact their views are quite similar to that of the Japanese public. And just as an example of the normalization, thank you very much for coming back to the room, but my more former student, who is Jerry's grandchildren, I guess, is in the back.
Jerry, you've got grandchildren.
I think it's rather, I'm not sure if anybody has seen a uniform of the self-defense forces, but you're Major Yeah, Major Tsukamoto, who's now an exchange officer at West Point. And he came in uniform because I thought that's still kind of new to you. And I'm really glad that he's here today. But that's part of maybe the normalization process, that there isn't that much of antipathy towards people in uniform, although it's not that common. So I like to highlight that he came in uniform. Thank you. You left the room once. I was worried that he's not going to come back, but I'm glad you're back. The second aspect of the normalization, how it's changed, is there has been a series of enabling legislations since the 1990s. And I think it's interesting that it happened more in an outside-in way, that there was legislation enabling peacekeeping operations abroad than more domestic. And also, so it's not just so the civilian controllers of military relations is not so much about restricting, but about when and how to use force. And so the when question could be explained by the enabling legislation. That's defining when. And in terms of how, there's been a series of administrative reforms to strengthen the power of the Prime Minister and the security apparatus, including the establishment of the National Security Council and some internal reorganization of Ministry of Defense, which gives more possibility for the uniform officers to have a say. But I would like to emphasize again that according to my survey results, that does not mean that there will be some major change in the course of Japanese policy, even if there is some kind of change in the relative power balance between the civilian and the uniform officers. So when I defended my thesis in October, this was where I ended. But I think things have turned to be more interesting after that, and that is that the recent debate over collective self-defense has, in some ways, revived the constitutionality issue. Not necessarily the constitutionality of the self-defense forces, but the constitutionality or how Japan still views the role of the military through the lens of the Constitution. And so I do share the views of many Japan experts who think that the Diet discussions was a missed opportunity in a sense, that there was a lot of important things that could be thought of in terms of deciding when and how the self-defense forces should be used, that there wasn't really a debate about what the Japanese security environment is and what the legislation will and will not provide in terms of what they can do, which is different from what has happened before and how it's going to enable Japan to address security challenges. Although that did take place, that wasn't the whole emphasis. And there wasn't really a big discussion of what is meant by proactive contribution to peace, which is obviously the central pillar of Prime Minister Abe's approach. And I think what we saw was more of a flashback of the debate that took place during the Gulf War about the constitutionality. And so I had to think about this again, and whether I thought that we had kind of started to overcome the constitutionality issue, but maybe I was wrong. And to think back in terms of Japanese approach in the past, of the more preoccupation with the protection from the military than protection by the military, I think the Constitution, especially in Article 9, is very popular because it actually seemed to offer a solution to both of those issues, which is that Article 9 seemed to provide protection from the military by constraining the choices of the self-defense force. In fact, it was actually constraining the choices of the politicians, but it was actually something that limited what Japan can do from the view of the Japanese public. And although there's less than before, there are still a considerable percentage of Japanese people who think that Article 9 was what kept Japan safe. So instead of the military, maybe protection by the military was not protection by the military, but by the existence of Article 9. So overall, I tend to think that it's actually a good thing that this issue came back. I think it would have been bad if it was just enshrined, and it was almost like a don't ask, don't tell kind of situation where people didn't really ask if they thought the self-defense force was constitutional. It was just not a nice thing to ask anymore. I think it's actually good that it came back, because if Japan's civil military relations become truly normal, I think it means that it's not the Constitution that protects the Japanese people from the military, or it's not the Constitution that provides safety, but in fact it's the public and the elected officials that are elected by the public that should be able to control the military, and it's not that the Constitution provides some kind of an autopilot mechanism for the Japanese politician and electorate to control the self-defense forces. So that's my
Great, thank you, Takako. I think all of us understand that Article 9 identifies this restricted role in Japan for the use of force to defensive means, right? But Article 66, of course, is the article that, under the Constitution, when it was drafted, Article 66 is the article that focuses on this question of civilian control. But I think this debate over time, and I'm dying to read your dissertation now, on who exercises civilian control in Japan, who ought to exercise civilian control in Japan, is, I think, one of the fundamental political questions on the security debate today. So thank you for that. Andrew, you know, you and I often meet at all kinds of gatherings in Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C. may be the place where this idea of a normal military comes from, the language of a normal Japan, a normal military. How far has Japan come in changing the way it thinks about the self-defense force? And do you accept this normal label for the way we think about the Japanese and the use of force?
Thanks. Although we're honoring Jerry today, let me also point out that, as you said, in Washington, I'm surrounded by my Columbia senpai, who have really helped me get adjusted to life in Washington and to understanding, beyond the politics, than the policy angle more. So Sheila, I see very often, Bill Heinrich, Victor Cha, and others. So it's fun to see you all in the room somewhere other than in Washington. Well, as you know, my first book that came out of my doctoral dissertation here was called Normalizing Japan, and it was meant to be a double entendre. A few of the reviews didn't catch that, but the idea was that, yes, there is, on the one hand, this pressure there is a pressure for Japan to normalize by the U.S. and also within Japan. You know, a number of political conservatives push that idea. But also in my book, I was seeking to make the argument that for generations and generations of Japanese people, Japan's security policies are normal. And so in my book, I was trying to explain how, from a Japanese perspective, their policies are very normal. So I was normalizing Japan for an external audience. And I appreciate on the few reviewers who picked up on that, even though I explained that in my preface. But I think that it is important, though, as we're thinking about changing in Japanese security policy and looking at public resistance for change, you know, to reflect on the fact that no Japanese soldier has died in combat in 70 years, right, in over 3 generations. And in that period, Japan rebuilt from war, became much more prosperous than it was before the war. And as we heard on the first panel, became a leader of peace building, of the idea that democracy and capitalism isn't just something that comes out of Europe. And so this is a tremendously positive legacy, and also one that I think, if you think of it this way, it's clearly a tough sell then to say to the next generation, well, so we should now do something totally different or very different. And so I don't expect to see something very different. In my next book that's currently out for review right now, I hope to see in print next year, I describe what's happening in Japan today, and the title of the book is Japan's Security Renaissance. And what I mean by that is that I think there's been a sort of awakening to the need for new approaches to military security, but that this look to the future is still based in part on looking back to the past. Just like the European Renaissance combined new thinking about science and literature, but was also sparked by looking back to a rediscovery of ancient texts and seeing what was good about the European past. And also, just like the European Renaissance, this new thinking about security in Japan just isn't just about military thinking. It has social dimensions, it has political dimensions. And so in terms of your question, Sheila, about thinking about the self-defense force and views of that, I think it's important to consider evolving views of the self-defense forces from different angles, including social angles, political angles, and military angles. So for example, I think it's actually on the social side that there's been the biggest change. So, I mean, as Kako mentioned, and we have a very convenient prop in the room, thank you. You now see Japanese military officers in uniform quite regularly, especially in my circles, in the Japanese embassy or at think tank events in Washington. It's quite common to see Japanese soldiers in uniform. If you watch television dramas in Japan, there are characters who are self-defense force officers. in international conferences as well now, it's not at all unusual to see a self-defense force officer make comments with the disclaimer that, it's the personal views and such. And so that's a really big social change. And I think in politics as well, I think that Japan is now largely beyond the taboo that used to be in place that a self-defense force officer should not go into the Diet, should not testify in the Diet, should not meet with Diet members, should not meet individually with elite bureaucrats, and quite the reverse in part of the new big changes in Japan in the last few years was the establishment of the National Security Council in 2013, which has a very big role for uniformed officers of the self-defense forces. And then there is, I think what most people think about when you think about policy change is on the military side, right? What is going to be the change in actual military policy as opposed to the social side or the politics? Here I think the change is less than in the other areas. And I actually think that as we go out in the next few years, that there's bound to be a time where Washington is deeply disappointed in what Japan actually delivers. I think the expectations are much too high because we have the sense that the media reports that there's been so much change. I think in principle, given the new security legislation, there could be a lot of change if you look at the kind of the wording of the legislation. But in practice, I think it's not so much change. And I think this is because the Japanese public as a whole, so I really like Takehiko's point about it's the public that controls the Japanese military and through elected politicians. It's not the Constitution that protects the public. So the public, I think, as a whole still supports significant limits on the use of the self-defense forces abroad. And in addition, a separate factor is that there's serious budgetary limitations to a greatly expanded role for the self-defense forces, which links somewhat to our last panel. So let me just conclude this opening point on a kind of personal note. I began the study of Japan from my home state in California, growing up in Los Angeles in the late 1980s, when Japanese commercial interest had purchased about 25% of downtown real estate in Los Angeles. And Japan's economy was about 60% of the size of the US economy and on the rise. Today, it's China that's this rising economic power. It's the second largest economy in the world. It's even larger than that 60% share that Japan was back in the 80s. Well, where is Japan in this? It's at about 25%. It depends on how you measure. It's about 25% the size of the US economy. So it's just simply not the partner that it once was. And as a result, I think we can see in actual policy documents of the US and of Japan, both of us are looking for additional security partners. And I think that this is another factor in it's a major shift in Japanese thinking about security, that it's not just about Japan and the US anymore. And so on the positive side, I think that we see continued similarity of approaches and harmony of interest between the US and Japan in both of our official security strategies are looking for new partners in the region and then deepening our own partnership. But on the less positive side, in terms of a shift in attitudes, I don't think that the shift in attitudes about the use of the self-defense forces is nearly as much as U.S. government would like. And so in the sense, I think there's still going to be this pressure for normalizing Japan.
Thank you. Excellent. I think one of the things that I witnessed in sitting in Washington, D.C., watching U.S. policymakers watch the debate on collective self-defense in Japan was that there's a certain, at the policy level, there's a certain desire to have clarity. What can Japan do and what can't it do? And that clarity, I think, especially as you're sitting in a region now where there is a little bit more of a worry about a crisis, a worry about managing a crisis, not necessarily going to war, but understanding how our two militaries, what the parameters of their ability to act together would really be. So, in some ways, we understand the U.S. role as pushing Japan to do more, do more, do more. And of course, that's always been part of the alliance dynamic. It's not just for Japan, for other allies as well. But I think the clarity, piece of the puzzle here that's not often understood outside the Beltway is the need for clarity in the conversation between the two allies. Aki, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about what you think is going on in terms of Japan's national identity in the security debate. The new security legislation that passed in September, right, was deeply criticized in the region. question, as we know, but we'll leave that to the next panel to discuss. But it was also a trigger for pretty remarkable opposition inside Japan. And there's new people who came to the fore, SEALs and other kinds of activists. We saw people in the streets around the diets. Did Prime Minister Abe go too far? What were the politics in your mind that stimulated this, and how does it relate to our sense that Japan or Japanese think that they need to do more to enhance their security?
Okay. I'd like to share with you one episode about relating to this new security registration. A friend of mine who was a president of a fairly large private university in Kyoto, he was asked by the coalition government to appear in the lower house committee to do a testimony in defense of this new registration. The next day, or the few days after he made his remark in support of this registration, a group of about 90 leftist professors and staff members from his own college issued a statement fiercely criticizing him by saying what he said in the diet. And they said something like, "We are really, really ashamed of him." And last month, there was a presidential election at this university, and he lost to a candidate who ran against him from this particular group. So, my wife happens to be a graduate of this university, so she was very concerned about the developments. And I told her, I cannot believe that he has to step down from his position by saying what believes is in Japan's national interest. And my wife said to me, "You can say anything you want, but not until we paid off all our house mortgage." The mortgage issue aside, I think this represents the strong opposition, frustration, uneasiness among Japanese intellectuals about this security registration and what Prime Minister Abe's political agenda. But having said that, I do not think that this new security registration represents a significant departure from the past. I think there's a gap between rhetoric and reality on this issue. The rhetoric is that, yes, Japan can send its self-defense forces, SDFs, abroad for a combatant activities. Some rhetoric even goes so far as to argue that Japanese post-war pacifism has come to an end. But I think if you read the legislation carefully and listen to what the government is actually saying, I think the Japanese government is still very constrained on what it can do. For example, the new registration, the Japanese self-defense forces can go abroad, but mostly engage in non-combatant activities, logistical support, not the direct the military combat activities. Prime Minister Abe specifically rejected the idea that he would send SDF to Middle East for combatant activities. Also, there are two specific concrete cases or scenarios where Prime Minister Abe thinks that the self-defense forces can be used for actual combat. One is when the U.S. ship is under attack in the Sea of Japan, the Japanese maritime self-defense force can fight back. Another another scenario is that some country, specifically North Korea, launched a long-range missile towards the U.S. continent, and Japan would use the missile defense system to fight back and shoot down the missiles while it's flying over Japan. But these two cases, or these two contingencies, are not likely to happen. So my sort of sense or take is that, yes, there are some changes, but this new registration is not necessarily a significant departure from the past. It rather follows the past post-war pattern of gradual Japanese enlargement of Japanese defense force roles for the peace and stability in East Asia. So that's my opinion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Aki. So Andy Nathan, when he asked us to preside, he said, I want you to provoke. So I'm going to provoke. It's been 70 years since the end of World War II. Japan is now surrounded by a nuclear North Korea, a nuclear China, a South Korea that seems to view Japan slightly differently than it has in the past. And of course, many people are looking at the United States and wondering really whether our power and our projection, force projection in the region is sustainable. Don't you guys think it's time that Japan began to think differently about its military power and its security? Isn't it time for Japan to hedge just a little bit in case the U.S.-Japan alliance is really not enough to protect Japanese security? You want to jump in?
I'll take a stab at that
Thank
to
you.
start. Just to make a related comment, in the discussions, as these discussions of security policy were going on in Japan and covered a lot in the U.S. media, I found that in living in Washington, I would be at these sort of cocktail parties and meet some elected officials, U.S. elected officials, that all of a sudden Japan was on their radar that never really thought about. And that question that you just asked is exactly the question that I was asked several times. And so this kind of links to your first question, that in terms of thinking about the U.S. pressure on Japan to change more, sort of ironically, I think the discussions of this and having more American leadership aware of the kinds of constraints may actually lead to more pressure on Japan to do more. So I think that it is time for Japan to think more carefully about using force. But as Takehiko said, I think this is one of the main changes that's happened under this security renaissance, is setting up practical rules for actually using force, to think more strategically about how Japan would use force. I think we see this in Japan's national security strategy, the first formal national security strategy in the National Security Council setup, and most dramatically, we see this as I don't know if I would go so far as call it a hedge, although some of our colleagues in Washington, like Jeff Horning, calls this a hedge against China in his published work. But the practical shift of self-defense force resources and strategy from the north to the old Soviet Cold War threat down to the southwest to better protect the Senkaku Islands in particular, I think shows that there is a much more realistic thinking about, this is a military that might actually be used. It isn't just for show.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think one of the things that the island dispute has done is open up the possibility, not just for security planners in Tokyo, but also for security planners in Washington, is open up the possibility for the first time in the post-war period that you could have a use of force incident, maybe at a lower level, but a use of force incident against Japan before the United States was involved. Right. And this flips on its head in many ways the way the U.S.-Japan alliance has operated in the post-war period. We've always pulled Japan along, wanting more support, more resources, more money. But in fact, now we're going to have to think about the alternative, which is that Japan could find itself in situations in which the United States is going to have to think about how it's going to respond and be able to respond to Japan. Takako, a more assertive Japan, a more militarily independent Japan, do you think that's on the horizon?
I don't really see hedging in the sense of hedging from the U.S.-Japan alliance. One of the consistencies in Japanese public opinion polls is how the public sees the relationship with the U.S., alliance relationship with the U.S., to be, when they're given a choice between the U.S.-Japan alliance, independent defense, or complete neutrality, it has always been more than 82% say that U.S.-Japan alliance, and it's been stronger. So I think there's more reason for that to happen than the alternative. But I think And one more thing about the recent debate. I don't think that it's that there is no perception of an increased sort of threat or some more security environment being more harsh. And I think it's because, I've thought of that because there was a lot of discussion about how the security legislation is a war legislation which might lead to conscription. And I thought that was really puzzling because if you didn't think that there was some kind of external threat, it's really hard to think of a situation in which Japan would have to go to conscript people. And that, how can you actually think that? So I thought maybe there is some perception that things are getting kind of difficult, and that might have led to the fear that that might lead to conscription in the future, given the number of children declining. And since I have an 18-year-old son, I kind of understand where that's going and how that could actually mean a lot to some people. So I think it's not that the Japanese people don't realize that there's a threat. Even those who oppose the security legislation, I think there is a sense that something has been changing. But having said that, I think that two things. One, I mentioned that I did a civilian elite self-defense force officer poll, and some of the questions that I asked in that is almost similar to the cabinet administrative office poll, so that I can kind of piggyback on that results to compare the opinion of the public and the civilian elite and self-defense force officers. One interesting thing is that I found was in the question of the U.S.-Japan alliance being the good way to keep Japan safe. If you add it really helps and relatively helpful. If you add the two up, the number for the public and the civilian elite self-defense force is about the same, which is about 90%, 80%, 90%. But both the civilian elite and self-defense force officers tend to answer straightforward, it helps, rather than relatively speaking. So you can see that the Japanese public perceives that there's no choice. That's kind of the scenario, but they're not as enthusiastic, maybe, or comfortable with the fact that that's the case compared to the civilian elite and self-defense force officers. So that might be where, although the rational response of the Japanese public is for them to think, and it seems to be that's what they think, is to ally more closely with the U.S. If that involves doing more for the sake of the alliance, including the exercise of self-defense, collective self-defense, that's something that has to happen. Still, in terms of the enthusiasm of how that's perceived, might be a little bit different if you ask the civilian elite or the Japanese public. And there might be some kind of misunderstanding on the elite side about what the Japanese public or where the Japanese public is on this issue, which might make it more difficult than might be perceived in Washington, D.C., about how the Japanese public is on board about the strengthening of the Japanese side of the alliance.
Yeah, it also goes back to your earlier point, I think, about the missed opportunity in the diet debate for the security planning elite or the government to actually encourage the Japanese public to see a little bit more clearly what the cause and effect is in terms of policy change. Aki, I am not going to ask you the same question because I don't want to have your wife mad at me because the mortgage is in trouble. But I want I want to ask you a different, not an opinion question, but rather an analytical question. If we were going to look for advocates in Japan for a more robust military capability on the part of Japan, for an identity in Japan that included equal access to the use of military force as an instrument of national power, where would you direct us to look? Where and how do you see that evolving? If it's going to come, where will we find it?
Certainly the self-defense force people, they would like to have a larger
Back in the back.
role, I think.
Don't put him on the spot.
Okay, I won't. Yeah.
But a certain group in Japan, the nationalistic conservative group, who would like to have Japan playing a larger role in East Asia, and given the rise of China and threat of North Korean nuclear weapons, I think, even the newspapers like Sankei and Yomiuri, they have strongly advocated that Japan should be doing a lot more than what it has been. So you can find those, advocates in the Japanese society much easier today than we used to in, say, 20 years ago.
How about people, Aki, who are more worried about the United States and the sustainability of the U.S. presence in the region? Where would we find, because that actually starts to involve some of your policy elites as well.
Right.
Is that right?
I think you're right that there's a growing fear in Japan of of an abandonment. That is to say, U.S. may not come to help Japan when there was a military conflict between China and Japan over Senkaku. So during the Cold War, I think the fear of entrapment, that is to say, Japan might be getting involved in a war of American making, was much stronger. But today, I think gradually the fear of abandonment is growing. But I don't think that many people start advocating that Japan may take a different path, like Hejim. A few years ago, Prime Minister Hatoyama Yukio proposed Japan should go along with China and other East Asian countries to form a East Asian regionalism framework. But his plan didn't go far enough. First of all, it didn't involve the United States. It was strongly opposed by the US, opposed by China. So any regional framework that Japan is trying to play a leadership would be very, very difficult. So I think now, instead of looking for alternative policy option, I think the Japanese government has moved to strengthen the US-Japan bilateral relations.
Excellent, thank you. So we've had too much fun up here, I apologize. I think the time is now to open the floor to the audience. I see hands are going up very quickly. So what I think we'll do on this round is take a few questions, and then we'll go back to the panel, and we'll gather a second round of questions and come back again. Win Lord, I think you were first hand to go up. The mics are coming. Is there one mic or two mics, just out of curiosity? Oh, the second one, okay.
Winston Lloyd, International Rescue Committee. In my career, I spent a lot of time on Asia. First, a note about Jerry. We've heard an awful lot of flattery today. We're going to hear a lot more.
There's more later.
If it were anybody but Jerry Curtis, he would be truly insufferable by the time this day were over. But he is Jerry Curtis, and he won't be. I would like to say that I practice the most sincere form of flattery, namely imitation. Whenever Jerry speaks, I take furious notes, shamelessly steal his intellectual property, and then put it in my own speeches that look terrific. Now, we've heard a lot about the role of Japan's military. I'd like to get a better sense of its capabilities. Two major threats mentioned would be perhaps maritime disputes with China or missile attack by North Korea. How capable are the Japanese forces for these particular contingencies? And what is the government doing in terms of increasing its budget? I get the sense it's not increasing all that much. And for what contingencies is it increasing its budget? So we've heard about psychology, we've heard about potential roles, but I don't have, not being an expert, a really good sense of how well Japan could fulfill these roles.
Great, excellent question. I thought I saw somebody in the back, but they've gotten shy all of a sudden. This gentleman right here on the edge. I'm sorry, sir, I don't need.
Thank you. Samuel, so there has been a lot discussed this session and a little bit in the first session. But it seems to be not clear in many ways. So that's why I'd like to pinpoint out a more clear, straight answer to my question. First of all, according to Japanese constitution, budgetary limitation, 1% of GDP. And second is Article 9. This is again majority of constitutional lawyers against the change of or interpretation of obvious Article 9. Another one is not national referendum, but a large group of polls did show, if I recall correctly, some 50% of the population against the new legislation. My last question is, as it is written currently, new US-Japan defense guidelines, is that Japan's role is limited to logistical support or include offensive operation. Also, North Korea nuclear issue was raised this time, but I'd like to ask a long-time expertise in this area. I'd like to hear from him. Leon Seagal, he's here.
Thank you very much. I think you just gave us 5 or 6 questions, but we'll try and do our best. Jim Gannon, I think you were next, and then there's one more question behind you, and then we'll stop and go back to the panelists.
Thank you. I'm Jim Gannon with JCI USA. That's the Japan Center for International Exchange, and I'm not just one of Jerry's children, but he actually introduced me to my wife as well. Just grabbing your crystal ball, looking out over the next decade here, these changes to legislation, constitutional interpretation, over the use of the military, are we going to continue to see the same trajectory of continued changes, or is that done for the next decade and the focus is going to be on consolidating these changes and how to operationalize them? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. There was a lady who I can see, but I can't quite see your face, and there you are. If you wouldn't mind standing up, that would be a little helpful. You can see you. There you are.
Jennifer Dwyer, Columbia University. I unfortunately was never one of Jerry's students, but I think I fall in the stepchild category. Anyway, I just have a sort of empirical question. Many, many decades ago, I did a public opinion survey about the Japanese attitudes towards nuclear weapons, and there were significant differences across generations. So I'm just wondering if one of you has looked at public opinion concerning the changing role or potentially changing role of the self-defense forces, and if there's significant variation across generations, that might well tell us something about the future of Japanese defense policy. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. You guys have all had time to absorb some of these questions. I'm not going to pick on you, but if you would like to address, first of all, anybody would like to address Winlord's capabilities question? I can do that if you'd like, but I'll hold that then if nobody else wants to do it. No? Let's do the straight answers then. 1% of GDP is not actually embedded in the Japanese constitution, just as a corrective there. But Japan continues to spend 1% of GDP. Is that a policy that could change easily, or is it on the verge of changing? And the next is this question of, is the reinterpretation of the right of collective self-defense unconstitutional, as many constitutional lawyers in Japan articulate? Anybody want to jump in there? My panel has gotten very quiet.
Can I take the first one?
Okay,
then?
Takako, you go ahead.
Relatively uncontroversial compared to the second one. As for the 1% limit on the spending, it is true that the Abe administration has been increasing the defense budget, but it has remained within the 1%, although there's no real restrictions per se. Just a couple of things. I think that coming back to the Cabinet Administrative Office poll, which I keep on referring to because that's the only public opinion poll that's been asking consistent questions over the years, there has been a somewhat an increase of those who responded there should be some increase in the defense budget from 24.8% to 29.9%. So that could mean something, that might not mean something, but that's that. But considering the current status of the Japanese budget overall, I don't really think that it's going to double or triple at all. I think it's just going to be very gradual. And so that's my take. But I guess in terms of the capacity, even if the budget is the same, there has been major thinking about how to reshuffle the Japanese self-defense forces. And some argue for a stronger emphasis or spending on the maritime and air self-defense forces. Sorry, Major Tsukamoto, but that's actually that. And also within the ground self-defense forces, more emphasis on placing troops on the southwest area of Japan, possibly for use on the island defense, utilizing the forces or the equipment that's currently in Hokkaido, which seems to make more sense. So that's already happening. So that's my take on the capacity question.
Thank you. Aki?
I want to respond to Jennifer's question about the generational gap in public opinion, but towards Japan's military forces or self-defense forces. I thought that we have more younger generations who have no direct experience from the war, may have a positive view towards revising constitution, or Japan having a larger military responsibility. But it turns out that even younger generation would like to stick to the Article 9 of the Constitution. I talk to my students in my class. I teach at the Japanese university, and having received a graduate education at Columbia's political science department, I thought that the Japanese Constitution, Article 9, has to be changed to reflect the reality of what the Japanese Defense Forces really is. But many of the 18, 19, 20 years old students prefer preserving Article 9. And I ask them why. And they say that we all know that the Constitution, Article 9, is kind of like a pipe dream, not necessarily reflecting the reality. But we still want that over there because we can't believe 100% our politicians. And we want those idealistic documents so that if something wrong happens in the future, these documents may provide some protection. So I think their view is that even if there is a gap between Constitution and reality of Japanese Defense Force, they are still okay with that. And I think younger students, younger generation believes in that. So that's my take.
If I could make a comment then on the capabilities issue and just a kind of a footnote on the budget for people doing comparative work. Something that's worth noting is that the value of the yen has declined substantially in the last few years. So if you look at international data on Japanese defense spending, it's going down in dollar terms, like SIPRI data or something like that. Whereas in yen terms, the spending is going up. And so it sort of depends on how you want to look at this, but it seems to me that it's the yen terms that generally is more important in terms of how Japan is spending. I think in terms of capability as well, what we've seen not just under the Abe administration, but really from the start of the 21st century, increasingly detailed defense planning and strategy to get more sort of bang for your buck, essentially. So as we talk about changes that's happening in Japan recently, I think it's very important in the security realm not to just say this is an Abe agenda. In my view, it was actually under the DPJ, the 2010 National Defense Program guidelines that really were the most substantial change in Japanese strategy. And even before that, in 2004, you see an increased attention to capabilities. So, at sort of the military nerd level, looking at things like missile defense, at radar arrays, at Congo-class destroyers, increasing the number of submarines. All of these capabilities are increasing, and so I think they are directly in response to concern of North Korean missile attack. For example, that's what missile defense is for, and the discussion of preemptive strikes is at least throwing out a kind of deterrence idea, even if Japan doesn't yet have cruise missiles. And in terms of Japanese naval capabilities, although Japan, it's difficult when you compare Japan and China's military capabilities to each other directly, because China is a much larger country and has 14 land borders with other countries and is trying to match U.S. power to a degree. But if you try to look at specific scenarios, like a naval battle in the area around Japan and China, I think it's pretty close to an even match, or the maritime self-defense forces may actually have a stronger position even without considering the U.S.-Japan alliance. So I think it's a good question, because we have this, some people have the sense that Japan has very limited military capabilities, when actually it's one of the most capable militaries in the world. And to mention Jim Gannon, to respond to Jim Gannon's question about next steps, my personal view is that there was a wide range of things that not just conservatives again, but those concerned with Japan's defense capabilities wanted to sort of tick off the box. And I think that boxes are mostly ticked off at this point. So I don't think that we could, if I had more time, I could list 10 or 15 major changes that have happened in the past 8 years or so. I don't think there's another wish list of 10 to 15 more things to do. The holy grail, I think, for some would be actually changing Article 9, but I don't think that has as much support as some of the other things that have actually passed, like setting up a National Security Council.
Great. I'll just add a couple of points for things that people probably can't talk about or feel uncomfortable talking about. Just start with Winlord's question. The contingencies and the missions have changed significantly since 2004. So the last National Defense Program guidelines in 2004 really set out a priority list for the self-defense forces, began with ballistic missile defense, second down was island defense, and then it went on to more traditional ideas of what the self-defense force need to do. But I think that the Japanese have largely invested an awful lot of money in ballistic missile defense. I think it's the most sophisticated in Asia, and it's also interoperable with us. So I would say if anybody is capable of ballistic missile defense in Northeast Asia, it is Japan. But the technology, as you know, the technology keeps having to keep pace with what we think could happen in terms of missile attacks. The island defense mission really has two components to it. One is the reorganization of the self-defense force, especially air and maritime, but not exclusively, to the southwestern Japan. So they now have what they call a southwestern wall strategy, largely led by the ground self-defense force, but including obviously maritime and air components to that. The ground self-defense force has not yet gotten everybody on the ground that it wants to get on the ground in the islands of Okinawa, but you'll see small measures, such as in Yonaguni, which is the island closest to Taiwan and critical to the senkakus, right, of the surveillance. You'll see now a radar station and another listening station. So you'll see both active and passive arrays being placed there operated by the air self-defense and ground self-defense force. Very small, but important and critical for East China Sea. The ISR, or what they call intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, is the place where I see that Japan spending the most money, especially in the last several years, and that has to do with China's maritime presence in and around Japan. More submarines. Japan has always had submarines, but they're going to have more. So you should expect to see those assets in larger numbers in the future. It's hard to know whether or not they're up to the job until the job presents itself. But I think this is a Japan, both a civilian and a military planning community that is emphasizing preparedness and readiness, and they need to be more ready and prepared than ever before, and I think that's the emphasis going forward. Jennifer, I think on your question on polling data on nuclear, I tried to find some of that recently, and I don't see it. Sorry, Glenn, she's right behind you. So I haven't seen any recent good polling on the nuclear option in Japan, but I just wrote a paper that I'm going to build into my newest book, but it's the political leadership in Japan is really quite open about the fact that they have a hedge, right? And I think that one of the impacts of 311 is to raise this question of, can Japan maintain its nuclear technology and its capability, so that if they ever want to exercise the hedge, they have the capacity to do it. I don't think the scientific community in Japan is interested at all in weaponizing fissile material. But I think the position of the Japanese government over time has been to ensure that that option exists should Japan ever need to resort to it. I don't think that we're anywhere near that point, that decision-making point, however. So that's the only thing I would say there. We are running out of time. Andy Nathan is looking at the clock. Shall we do another round, Andy, or should I call it to a close? You're the boss. Better close it. All right. We will have a coffee break for 15 minutes. Please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent discussion.